Welcome, everyone. The Well Integrity Technical section of the Society of Petroleum Engineers is pleased to present this webinar titled CCS Project System Integrity, Engineering and Regulatory Reality Checks. My name is Pierre-Edouard Vincent, and together with my fellow WITS officer Jovan Stojkovski, will be your hosts and moderator today. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on demand later. Today's webinar will run for an expected duration of 90 minutes max, but will not have a hard stop. Bhaskar Murugapan will be giving a 45-minute technical presentation originally targeting students and regulators. And Adam Peltz at EDF will give a 15-minute overview of current CCS regulatory frameworks. This will be followed by a 30-minute panel discussion and live interaction Q&A with the audience, which can be both from LinkedIn and YouTube. Feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring the queue and we'll address as many questions as possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce Bhaskar Murugapan. Bhaskar started his career more than 25 years ago, and after working for 8 companies around the world, decided to use his production technologist, PT, skills towards the energy transition in 2020. He's a principal engineer for low carbon fuels, CCS, hydrogen, geothermal, for a leading operator. He is also adjunct professor at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, where he also graduated with a BS in petroleum engineering. Bhaskar is a regulatory advisor for energy transition, CCS, geothermal, and hydrogen with multiple US states. Bhaskar, thank you for joining us. Adam Peltz is director and senior attorney at Environmental Defense Fund, an organization he has been with for over 15 years. He holds degrees from Boston University in law and international relations. Adam, thank you for being with us today also. Bhaskar, I'll let you manage the show for now, and the floor is yours for the next 45 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Let me go on full screen mode. Okay. I'm assuming you can see this presentation.
Yep, we can see it full screen.
Okay. All right. This presentation is a little different in terms of CCS because we're going to dive into the regulatory and the engineering perspectives that CCS projects require. In the lower left-hand corner, you actually see several icons of regulators, but the regulators that we are advising at this point right now there are 4 in the US, they are states. There are 3 in Asia that are government regulators and 4 in Europe that are also government regulators. The 31 principles work in the area of CCS. So this presentation has been vetted by a lot of people, primarily because we're trying to bring a topic that is not very well discussed. Okay, so the disclaimer. This presentation was originally prepared for students and regulators and political representatives. So it's kind of squished into 45 minutes. As the youngest of the 31 principals, I was picked as a presenter because this is a very difficult subject to discuss. And we're going to try to make it simple enough so that everybody sort of understands why this presentation was put together. The engineering discussions, oddly enough, was simple, but the legal and political and the time discussions were far more complicated. So we're trying to bring a point across so that people actually understand, or engineers actually understand, the implications of what we are trying to do with CCS. Now, the reality is that it took 3 years to develop this presentation, and I had to actually retire before this presentation could be brought forward. It brings a middle ground between all the political arena. So on the left side, you see the government and the regulators, and on the right side, you see the NGO. On top, you see the oil and gas. Most of these principals and regulators um, couldn't really voice all their concerns because generically they worked for one of these agencies. So you don't normally talk about this when you go into a meeting. Uh, and this is why this presentation was very difficult to actually bring forward. And we finally did, and almost everybody agreed to it after they vetted it. All right. That's a little bit about me. I think Vincent spoke quite a bit about me already. Those are my kids on the right side. I did explain CCS to them, and that was their look. All right. Agenda. Uh, there is lessons learned regarding CCS and CCUS projects. In the projects, there is well-designed reservoir selection, operations, monitoring, and well integrity economics. But we're not going to talk about items 1 and 2, because if we did, we'd be here all day. We're really going to focus ourselves on items 3 and 4, which is the regulatory oversight and the post-project stewardship. These two are almost never discussed when we talk about a CCS project. The first two items, there's a lot of presentations, there is a lot of webinars that talk about parts of it. So the focus is going to be really on item 3 and 4. Now, I like this particular slide because I picked it off one of the presentations quite a while back, and it gives you a full layout of what you're looking at in terms of CCUS, CCS, and CCU. I'm going to
Oscar,
assume yeah.
Oscar,
Sorry?
you have a pop-up window, showing your StreamYard is sharing your screen. So maybe you can hide that so we can see your
Ah,
screen better.
okay.
Perfect.
There you go.
Thanks.
Is that good? Okay. So this slide almost covers all the CCUS. So again, I assume that everybody in this meeting, because we work in the CCS field, understands the difference between CCUS, CCU, and CCS. Most of the projects here are CCUS projects. Almost 90% of it is CCS projects. So you see on the left side, in 1972, it started out with the oil and gas industry looking at CCUS project in EOR. So you can see these very large projects here in the lower left corner. And as time progressed, it sort of disappeared, got quiet, and it picked right back up again, where in this scenario, the blue bits right here are where power generation, natural gas, waste to energy, iron, steel, cement production, they came into play for CCS because they are hard to abate industries. So you notice that we've moved away from oil and gas into other industries looking at CCS. Now, we have almost 30 years worth of history in CCS and almost 40 years worth of history in CCUS. Now, the bits in purple are what we know of as today as real CCS projects. So you notice there are not a lot of CCS projects, even though there is a lot of projects here. Most of it is CCUS, where it's utilized for something. Most of the time it's EOR, sometimes it's done for factories. So that gives you an outline of the game we're playing right now. All right, now this is one slide that kind of tells you some of the CCS operating projects in the world right now. So you got Sleipner, Snøhvit, Gorgon, ADM, Mumba, Blueflint, Northern Lights. And it started back 30 years ago with Sleipner. But the one thing I want you to focus on this particular slide is the volumes on the right side. They're not very large volumes on a yearly basis. That's million tons per annum that you're seeing on the right side. The cumulative is there because of the years, but the yearly average rate is actually quite small. All right. And these, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of people telling me that I've missed a bunch of projects here, but okay. This is the main ones that we generally focus on when we're looking at lessons learned. So that's the reason I brought the slide up. All right. Um, I put this slide up because one of the legislators asked me, is CO2 dangerous? And I said, is it a hazard? Well, according to the EPA, it's not a hazard. It's not a toxic gas. However, CO2 can actually kill, mostly because it suffocates you. And we have incidents like this that has occurred in previous history. And I'm going to try to show this presentation, but I'm not sure whether it'll actually show it. Uh, you might read along the words and then it'll probably make more sense. Okay. So what what came out of this? This is not the first incident that this has actually occurred. This has actually occurred many, many times in history. So this is just one incident that this has occurred. So from the HIC perspective, we realized very quickly that okay, we don't have a volcanic problem, but we could conceivably have an eruption or a breach of the reservoir from surface. So this means that we had to look at what the surface topology looks like. So if the breach occurred at a very high ground, then we need to worry about what is downstream of the of the flow. This is something that we never actually considered. So as a HAC option, we started to look at saying, all right, what is the surface that we need to worry about? Is it a school? Is it a city? These are discussions that normally when you start looking at CCS projects, you never even consider. So from the HIC perspective, we had issues that we had to consider. All right. CCL well design, there is a lot of conversation about this. There are a lot of people actually engineering the issues. So most of the big issues are shown here. I'm not going to talk about all of them because it'll take forever, but I'm just going to pick certain items in here that we considered we are not really ready yet as of today, fully from the engineering perspective. Now, one of them is the fact that CO2 can actually be a liquid, a gas, and a supercritical fluid in the same well. In other words, if you're putting CO2 down here, that goes down the well, it actually becomes liquid and it becomes a supercritical fluid before it hits the reservoir. Now, once you change phase, you start to get temperature issues, Joule Thomson cooling or heating, depending on which direction this is, right? And this involves tubing movement. Okay, so as your temperature changes, your tube changes, and your pack starts to pull here, and your wellhead starts to pull here. So essentially, you got two anchor points, and your tubing is actually physically moving because it's contracting or expanding. Now, there are ways to deal with this, and again, there is engineering solutions to this. I mean, you can use a slip joint here, okay, and let it move. All right, but that would mean that you've got a leak here. Okay? Now, assuming you're able to handle this, you have an annulus, and then you have casing, which is cemented, the gray bit here. If you get the temperature change to hit the production casing, now your casing is going to contract or expand, meaning it's going to try to debond from the casing, the cement. If it's cement, if it debonds from the cement, you now have an annular path going up the surface. So from the engineering perspective, you can't allow all this to happen, and you can design your way out of this. It's not complicated. Um, the corrosion issue has been around for a while. Ever since EOR Wells has been here, we have this issue. I had recently a young engineer design a CCS well, and his entire string was carbon steel. And I asked a very simple question. I said, "Hold on, what are you going to do about the water?" He said, "Well, according to the contract, I only have 50 ppm. So I don't have any water. If I don't have any water, I won't have any corrosion." Fair. However, the project life of this well is 45 years. So for 24/7, for 45 years, you are guaranteeing that there is no water in the CO2 stream more than 50 ppm. If anybody has worked in the oil and gas industry, you will know that this is not possible. Okay, anyone who's worked in water floods will know that the water is never clean over that time period. So you have to look at it from a pragmatic point of view and say, right, I've got to design this in the worst case scenario, or the medium case scenario, not the best case scenario. And that's the corrosion. And then there is metallurgy, there's creeping formations, and there's change in core pressure. CCS wells in particular have got this odd behavior. They actually increase in pore pressure with time. This is not normal for oil and gas well design, right? And how we're dealing with that, we're not really sure yet. We're working through the issues. So this is kind of like a high level look at the big chunks of work that needs. Now, the next item that I'd like to talk about just briefly is well control. This is probably one of the items that is almost never talked about in CCS well design. And to put this in context, 1 barrel of supercritical CO2 at surface is about 410 barrels of CO2. Now, if you're drilling a well at 13,000 feet, 5.5 inch drill pipe, 7 inch casing, you're looking at about 120 barrels of annular volume. 1 barrel of supercritical CO2 is about 4 times the volume of an annulus, of a drilling annulus. This creates an issue with well control because well control doesn't understand phase change. It doesn't understand that I can actually go from a liquid to a gas phase. You have to say this, we haven't figured out how to deal with this yet. The second problem is that none of our well control equipment is designed for temperature changes. So as this supercritical CO2 is moving up the well and converting to CO2, it's getting cold. Your rams, your annulus are not designed for freezing fluids. And we know this because existing EOR wells already have seen this situation where the BOP stack has actually froze because of CO2 movement up the well. Uh, will we find a solution? Yes. In fact, one of the regulators actually asked me this question. He said, "Hey, given this, how do you kill this well?" And I have a IWCF level 4, and my only reaction was, "You're going to drill a relief well because I don't think you can actually kill something like this." So imagine if you had a breach at surface through an old well that's already existing and that's already there, not the new one that you just injected in. you would literally have to have a relief well to try to kill this. So there are a lot of things regarding well design that is being talked about. Right at the top right hand corner, there is a CCS design manual that started out with, I think, 20 pages, and now it's hit about 142 pages. I'll share that once this presentation is done, because this is written for a regulator, giving the design engineer what they need to look at when they design a CCS well. Okay, well integrity. This is a bit of a difficult topic. Now I'll just go through this chart here. So this would be the age, the number of years where the well is actually being utilized. Okay, so year one all the way to year 50, the CCS well is being used during the project. This is the pressure and the volume that's being injected. So with time, when you start, the pressure is very high. This is a normal oil and gas well, right? So the pressure is very high in the beginning. As you go in time, it decreases, and it flattens out. And same with the oil. Just ignore the red here. This is a well integrity index, and it takes probably a while to explain how this comes about. But you're looking at pressure, you're looking at volume, and both of them decline over time to a point where you go abandonment and you just ignore it, it just goes flat. Okay? This is normal for an oil and gas well in terms of integrity. However, for a CCS well, it's the opposite. So the volume starts out high, you inject a lot of volume, and then with time, it actually decreases quite rapidly because the pressure builds up. And as the pressure builds up, you actually inject less. However, the difference here is that the pressure that you're injecting actually increases as the well gets older. Now, this is completely abnormal to oil and gas. So this is like the easiest description I can give is like you're driving, and I had to explain this to legislators. Uh, you're driving a car, a brand new Honda car, right? And for the first 5 years, it's under warranty, everything is great. And then you hit 80,000 miles and things starts to break down. And then you hit 150,000 miles and you have to give up the car because it's just too old. So age and time doesn't help the car. And age and time doesn't help the well either, especially when the pressure is actually increasing. So um, I, the, e- even human beings work in the same manner. All right. So, for example, as I get older, I can't do what I did when I was 20. I could play for 2 hours football or soccer for 2 hours. Now I can, barely do 45 minutes. All right. As you get older, your integrity decreases with time. But in a CCS well, I literally have to go the opposite direction. I actually have to get stronger. And this is the oddity of a CCS well. Can we resolve this? Yes, there is a way to resolve this. It's a little bit ugly, but there is a way to solve this problem. Now, uh, reservoir integrity. This has been a conversation that it's a difficult conversation because uh, in one of the companies that I used to work for, the um, senior reservoir engineer told me, he said, hey, there are reservoirs in the world that hold CO2 for millions of years. Okay, so we know the integrity of those reservoirs, so you can do it. And my reaction really was, I'm injecting into a depleted reservoir or a reservoir that never held CO2. So you're not comparing apples to apples at this point. And we have instances where, even though we say the reservoir integrity is good, you know, history tells us that we are mistaken. Okay. Insala in Algeria in 2004, that's a perfect example. Snowvid is an example of that. Gorgon is an example of that. So even the reservoir doesn't necessarily have the integrity that we think it does. And you have to be cautious of these things. And can we get around this? Yes, we engineers. We will find a way to get around all of these things, right? But these are issues that you need to look at. Now, the financial considerations this is more complicated because I'm going to start from the right side here for the cost of storage. And the cost of storage, where we actually inject it down whole and we put the CO2, is about $5 to $10 a ton. The cost of transport is about $5 to $15 a ton, depending on whether it's a pipeline or a ship. But the real cost is actually the cost of capture. And it was slated at $20 a ton, but right now it's about anywhere from $60 to $100 a ton. So if you add up all these numbers, you're looking at almost $180 a ton. Now, economics is key. All right. You cannot run a project without good economics. All right. And these numbers, as much as they're put out, okay, has to be filled by something. In other words, it either is an ETS or a tax or a subsidy covers these costs. There is an alternative, but this only exists in the US. It's a class two, where it's a $10 to $20 a ton of CO2. And I'll talk about that in a minute on the next slide, because this is an important distinction. Um, this cartoon here, I picked it up from LinkedIn at some point. I love this cartoon because it really does describe where we stand. So at the very top is what class six looks like. All right. Class six is pretty much what CO2 sequestration is in the US and most of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, if you put absolutely pure CO2, you're looking at about $100 to $185 a ton. There is another version that only the US is doing right now, which is called class two acid gas wells. And these are CO2s with impurities. In other words, whatever is coming out of the stack, whatever is coming out is not cleaned. It's not pure, and it's in smaller volumes, and it actually gets to about $50 to $80 a ton. So there is a way to get around the economics. It's not pretty, but there is a way to get around the economic problem. All right. Uh, so that was items one and two. This is where I get into the regulatory and post stewardship conversation. And this is the crux of the whole presentation. Now, we are building CCS. In CCS, we're building a life imprisonment for a forever chemical. And why I say this is because when we put this down hole, it's going to stay down hole forever. There is no other means to it. And in essence, this chemical, or CO2, is a prison, in a prison that we have created till the end of time. So to make this easier for people to understand, and this particular slide was given to one of the government legislators, sorry, government legislation, to make them understand what we're dealing with. All right. So um, you're starting with a pore space owner. Um, and he owns, let's say he's a guy in Texas and he owns a ranch, 1,000 acres, and he owns a bunch of pore space underneath his land. And on comes along an operator and says, Rayo, you're going to lease it or buy it. Now, I'm not going to distinguish between leasing and buying because this is a hot political button right now. But he says, I'm going to lease it or buy it from you. I'm going to operate the project for 30 years and I'm going to monitor it for 50. Now, almost everybody in this webinar or going to watch this YouTube video is working in this area right here. And it's critical to understand what this actually means because we are only working in a 30 to 80-year time frame. However, the real problem is this, and I'm going to skip right ahead. So one of the legislators said, all right, you're going to put this, you're telling me you can design this field, you can put everything down whole, everything works. And I said, yes. And you do it till the end of time because the reality is once the operator leaves and we give them the release, because there is a release saying that you are now no longer obligated to any liabilities, right? The government now or the state takes over the pore space dominion and they take over the space dominion till the end of time. Okay, so imagine if I start a project in 2025, that is 3025, that's 1,000 years. So the legislator asked, hey, can you guarantee me that the CO2 will stay down there till the end of time? And I started laughing. I said, I don't even know what that means. I'm an engineer. Okay. Forever doesn't exist in my vocabulary. I can tell my wife I love her forever, but that's only for 100 years till I die if I live 100 years. So then he says, all right, 500,000 years. I said, nope, can't guarantee that. 10,000 years, can't guarantee that either. Then he said, can you guarantee at least 1,000 years? And that's where I made the mistake and said, maybe. Shouldn't have, because this picture right here describes 1,000 years. And my end date is 3025. All right. So 8% of the time, the operator is managing it. The other 92%, this is only in 1,000 years. The other 92% is held by the state or the government that owns the liability and owns the CO2. Okay. One of the older principals who's now retired came back to me and said, listen, do you even understand what 1,000 years mean? 1,000 years is a 10 generational prison, meaning your children, your children, your children, your children, 10 times out. Okay. And I actually had to put this on paper so that I actually understood what this meant. So if you go back in time, let's say I started 1,000 years earlier, all right, this would be what all I'd have to go through. So, the Khmer Empire was creating Angkor Wat, the Mongol Empire was just starting, Song Dynasty. Okay, so this is year 1025. You'd have to go to the Black Death, you'd have to go to Columbus, you'd have to go to the American French Revolution, you'd have to go through World War One, World War Two. So imagine you start in 1025 and in 80 years, you have done your project. Somehow, in the regulatory space, you'd have to monitor through all these events and have an agency that actually survived with documentation that this is how you're going to monitor the CCS project. Now, this is a very difficult thing to explain to people. It is, because we were talking about timescales that are abhorrent. Okay, we don't really understand this level of time. And you have to have an agency that is actually monitoring all of this once the project is done. And this is the regulator, right? So we have a history in end of time projects. Okay. Oil and gas started about 100 years ago. So we have about 100 years there. Water gas disposal, we have about 30, 40 years. Nuclear waste, which ironically is the closest similarity to CCS, is about 75 years old. Class one is about 120 years old. These are slurry disposal wells. And the frac disposal wells, which just started recently, is about 30 years old. And again, we try to bury the disposal wells, the frac water in disposal wells, but we keep failing because this right here, the geysers are occurring more than you think at this point. Almost every month you get one breach of water at surface. Fortunately, it's water. It's not CO2. It's not CCS, right? There is a bit about induced seismicity here that I'm not going to talk about because, again, we are going to monitor this for a very long time. All right. Okay. Now, from the regulator's perspective, this is how they would manage project, a CCS project. And this is something you don't normally see when you're doing a CCS project because you're looking from the outside in. This is from the inside out. So when you go to the regulator and ask for a permit, okay, this is kind of sort of in different ways how the flow process actually works, right? So initially there's a pre-application review, and then there is a permit. And in the permit, you have site characterization, AOR, your project planning, your stakeholder engagement, your well design, you have surface facilities, pipelines, financial assurance, operations MMV, you're talking about emergency response plan, you're talking about post-site ingestion care, all of this is written and given to the regulator. Now, this is the interesting thing. In an oil and gas company, you'd be looking at about 20 people with probably around 300 to 400 years worth of experience putting this together. But on the regulator side, you'll probably see two people, maybe three if you're lucky, that are actually looking at all of this and actually understand what this is. All right. Now, assuming that they get past this and they move along and they go into approval and they get the project permit and off they go, the next phase is the construction, in which case the regulator is now doing compliance, he's doing daily reporting, he's doing inspection. Again, the same thing when you're doing the injection, right? That is for 20 to 30 years. All right. And then you give him the closure permit and he closes all his wells up and he hands over that entire site to the regulator. This is 95% of the time how CCS projects operate. 95% of the time. Now, somebody can ask, why would you hand it over to the regulator? Isn't the operator still liable? No, the operator is no longer liable. He has handed over the entire project to the regulator. The state and the government is now liable. And the state and the government on gate 6, becomes responsible to the end of time. Now, how do they fund this? They normally fund this with a tax or a reclamation fund. However, that tax or reclamation fund that is charged per ton of CO2 being sequestered, however, has to survive forever till the end of time for the next 1,000 years. All right. Again, this is complicated. Okay. How do you monitor something for this length of a period? All right. And the regulators, I have to admit now, when that we talk with them, they are struggling with the same thing because they were only looking up to this point right here. They weren't looking past this. And this is where, like I said, the regulators are starting to understand that the liability is now falling on them to be able to maintain a CCS project. It's not that we can't design it. It's not that we can't operate it. What goes on after that is where the real crux of the problem begins. Now, whenever we talk about a CCS project, one of the interesting things that comes up is the sequestration area of concern, EOR. And when we look at the EOR, we are generally looking at this area right here. But in fact, what really happens from a regulator's point of view is he's looking at a cone. So he's looking at an area at surface about 4 to 5 times the size of what the CO2 storage looks like. Again, this is a very interesting concept because it's very, very similar to nuclear waste disposal, where even though they're burying it underground, they're looking at a much larger area at surface to monitor for all time. And imagine that your CO2 storage is, I don't know, let's say 100 acres. Your surface area is probably about 8, 9 times, 10 times that. So that area has to be monitored for a minimum, let's say, the next 1,000 years by the regulator. Again, from the engineering design perspective of a CCS engineer, we don't care because this is a regulator's problem. However, they need to be funded to be able to do something like this. Now, before I jump ahead, there is one item in here that I didn't discuss, and it's called mineralization. There is a big conversation whether you can actually, so mineralization is where CO2 is added with water, and as it goes into ultramafic or hot basaltic rocks, it actually converts itself into carbonates. So it becomes a solid form. This is rare because I think there's only 2 projects in the entire world that has proven this, but they've proven it with a very different type of rock. It's hot basaltic rock, not the rock that we are now injecting into. So mineralization is a plus if it works. We don't know. Again, 500 years from now, the CO2 might become mineralized. we don't know whether it will or it won't. So I don't want to go too much into that because that is being used as a reason to actually go ahead and do this. And from an engineering perspective, we look at data, we look at facts. If we can't prove that it actually mineralizes, we can't actually use that as a reason to say, yes, it is safe. All right. Again, this is looking at it from the regulator's point of view. And from the regulator's point of view, so this is where you have one CO2 project heading in here. And this is actually a real case, okay, where you have a reservoir rock. So this orange bit here is the reservoir rock, right? And it's faulted up pretty good. So what they did was they said, okay, look, here we have a class one slurry, all right. Here we have class two AGI, all right, injection. This is a water disposal. This is a geothermal, and this is a proposed class six CCS project. And through all of this, you got a whole bunch of oil and gas wells. Now, from a state or a government perspective, you're going to have to manage something like this across the entire country or the state. You're looking at pore space inventory management at such an extent at about 1,000 acres at a time. All right. And you're going to have to monitor every single horizon, what is in there to make sure that you haven't doubled up on it because pore space is pore space. So you're actually going to have to manage pore space at a massive scale. Now, I have yet to see a single regulator that has anything remotely close to this. But they will need to, at some point, develop something like this. Now, assuming that they have put all this in the hole and in different areas, now the question becomes, what do we do? How do we monitor all of this? So they're going to take this little area right here in the left side and say, we're going to monitor this, we're going to monitor the next one, next one, next one, next one. And all of this costs money and a very long period of time we're talking about right now. Okay, we're talking about 1,000 years at least that we're having this conversation about. How is the regulator going to do this? All right. It's a complicated subject because of the time spans. If this was a 100-year project, this would be easy. All right. But when we start talking about 1,000 or 2,000 years, time is your enemy. So to 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 put some reality to it, generically in a regulator's environment, the regulator, the person who's doing that work, has about 5 to 10 years in that space before he moves to something, he or she moves to something else. So this means that you're looking at about, if for 1,000 years, you're looking at about almost 100 people changing hands on the same project that he's monitoring. Just that's 1,000 years. Okay, assuming that in 1,000 years the problem goes away, right? So you're changing people and time. All right. What's the lessons learned out of all of this? Um, CCS is not economic on its own without subsidies, or carbon trading, or tax incentive, or co-production. Now, if you're going to take incentive or subsidies, you must do it over the entire lifespan of the project. So if the project lifespan is about 40, 50 years, that incentive and subsidies must survive that entire project. Now, incentive and subsidies are tax breaks. Um, Generically, these tax breaks and subsidies don't survive more than 15, 20 years. That's history. So you have to be careful when you do this, because if those subsidies go away at any one point in time, your CCS project is in trouble. Now, there is this option of carbon trading that has been brought up over and over again. This is new. Currently, right now, I think it's in Europe. I don't think it's actually in the US, but that may be the option on how to solve this. There's quite a bit of discussion about whether it's onshore or offshore. I have my own preference um, to be offshore, because you remember the earlier present video I showed you about CO2 breaching at surface. yeah, you rather have the breach offshore than you have it onshore, uh, for obvious reasons. Uh, CO2 is a waste product, but you have to manage it as a resource. And I think there's a lot of confusion because they keep saying this is a resource, but actually it's a waste product. But you use the same management process as you would as a resource. CCUS EOR, this is a monstrous story on its own, um, because the EOR projects are getting subsidies, 45Q subsidies. And at some point in time, they're going to come and ask, and they're already doing it, can we bury the CO2 in the existing EOR field? These EOR fields are 40, 50 years old with hundreds of wells in them. And this is a much more complicated story that needs to be addressed. Now, as I said before, an average CCS is around 100 to 185 tons. The ETS and 45Q is now hovering at about $70 to $80 a ton. So there is a gap in the economics that needs to be dealt with. The reason that picture I put on the right side here is because this area right here, oddly enough, has got a massive gas reserve of 6.3 TCF, but it's has about 30 to 80% CO2. Now, it's not really an issue because co-production of hydrocarbons allows the economics to work because you use the economics of the gas or the oil to actually pay for the CO2 sequestration. And they average around currently around $1.75 to $5.25 a BOE. So there is ways to get around the economics, but they are restrictive and they are limited. Okay, so we have a 50 to 60-year worth of history on CCUS and 30 years on CCS, right? We do know that CCS is a stopgap measure. It's not meant to be done forever. So maybe, I don't know, 50, 60 years from now, we'll stop doing it until some form of energy transition comes along. The economic viable options, and I say this loud, without subsidies, is if you're producing hydrocarbons. In other words, if you're producing hydrocarbons and you take out the CO2 and you sequester it, it makes sense, right? Um, I believe Gorgon is that way, and one or two other projects also have the very similar concept. Small volume, full emitter, single stream sequestrations like Blueflint, Sleipner, Snowit, they make sense, okay, because they're small volume. Now, there is a large conversation between bonding and insurance right now for CCS projects. Bonding are meant for the well in the project, but once the project is finished and the release permit is given by the regulator, the bonding is taken away. So the insurance carries on even after the project is completed. Now, does this insurance exist? I think it's coming into play right now. There are a number of players that are talking about this because you need some form of insurance if you happen to have a breach, let's say, I don't know, 200 years into the future. Okay. Somebody has to pay for that well kill or trying to seal the well that is now leaking. Um, Rule number one in engineering design, nothing lasts forever. Can we guarantee a CO2 storage for 1,000 years or the well? Maybe. Okay. Only time will tell. And this is on the regulator now to decide how they're going to do this. The long-term dominion of CO2 and the liability is always the state or the government. There's no choice in this. And I caution, I suppose, the states that are trying to get primacy because this actually only increases your long-term liability. And that long-term liability, which I just discussed, is rarely talked about. We're only looking at what it is today. We're not looking at what it is, 1,000 years ahead. There is a large portion of the world that is considering shipping CO2 to another country, where basically you take out the CO2 out and clean it up and you liquefy it and you send it to another country to actually get it injected. That's all fine. However, the liability and the financial cost of a release still falls to the emitter unless a different mechanism is already put together. All right. I don't think the country that is actually going to store it is going to say we're going to take full liability for this. One of the reasons that CCS is starting to pick up quite a bit actually offshore is that we have a lot of mature oil and gas facilities and reservoirs that we need to abandon. So CCS project actually delays the abandonment. But the point is that at some point you're going to have to abandon it anyway, even after the CCS project is done. So yeah, you kick the can down the road for the abandonment costs, but you pick up a whole bunch of liability associated with that in a CCS project. Okay, so where do we go from here? I just put a whole bunch of things on here, and I'll let you read what is on the right side here. And this just came out in February, of 11th of February. And the message from Equinor is quite clear. They are the leaders in CCS. There's no arguments here. We are ready technically. We know how to do the wells. We know how to do the reservoir. All right. However, the economics is not necessarily there at this point. We can't scale the CCS to align the markets. And I don't think the regulators actually understand what they've picked up in terms of liability. New Mexico wants to do primacy and take over the CCS Class 6. That's great, but then they're also taking over the liability. And you have an example there of a very large project, where you're going to pick up a whole bunch of CO2 from different industries. You're going to put it in a pipeline and you're going to send it downhole. Again, you're picking up a liability in a single data point, right? So this is my last slide. I'm from a regulator's perspective, from an engineering perspective, we know how to do CCS. The real question is, what are we going to do with the time element? Who is going to look after this once this is done? Okay, because unless you answer those questions, you left yourself open, because at the end of the day, if there is a breach or a release, let's say 300 years down the road, the taxpayer still gets to pay for it. Somebody has to kill that well, all right, or the breach at surface. So those questions are the hard questions that need to get answers, not whether we can actually design the well or engineer it or put it underground. It's what we do later that counts. And like I said, from an engineering perspective, the Achilles heel of any design engineer is pressure, rate, and economics, and time. Time is not our friend. So that's the last slide I have. Vincent, you want to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bhaskar. So I have a long list of questions and things I would love to discuss with you into some more details, but we'll keep some of those for later. And it's now my pleasure to have Adam present his perspective on the regulatory frameworks as a balance to what Bhaskar, alternative view perspective, what Bhaskar presented.
Great. Well, thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you, Pierre-Edouard. Let me see if I can get my screen shared here. You're seeing it?
Yep.
Great. And I'll try to keep this brisk so that we stay on time.
Perfect.
So great. So I agree with a lot of what Bhaskar said, and so that's one good way for us to start. Bhaskar from the operator side, and I'm coming from an environmental ENGO side. We'll get into some of the details as we go, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to have conversation. So my perspective is U.S. oriented for the most part, and I thought I would start with 2 slides with some maps to give a sense of scale. So these are some plots from the carbon solutions on the left, looking at estimated CO2 storage capacity. So you can see where that is. The Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast especially has a lot. There's good storage reservoirs in Illinois into Indiana. The Permian has various pluses and minuses, some in the Rockies, and then in California. And on the right, you can see how that corresponds to the costs per ton as well for where development is most likely to occur. And so keep these maps in mind while you look at this map. So this map shows the US states that have received Class 6 primacy from the EPA under the EPA's Underground Injection Control Program, which is the federal regulatory schema that covers all forms of underground injection, except for underground natural gas storage and hydraulic fracturing. So it's primarily EPA regulated. EPA regulations came into being in around 2008 or 2009. There was not a lot of activity for a while, and then the 45Q tax subsidy, which is required to support this activity, was increased significantly, and states started moving on primacy and legislation. So you could see that North Dakota, Wyoming, West Virginia, Louisiana, Texas, and Arizona all have primacy. And the states in purple are passing legislation to cover any number of issues, which we'll get into momentarily, and preparing themselves to request primacy from EPA. For the most part, most states have primacy over most forms of underground injection control. That's how the system was designed. It's not really practical for EPA to be directly regulating all this activity. The state regulators have the virtue of knowing their areas very well. There are pluses and minuses of taking on primacy. Bhaskar alluded to some of them. And so looking a little bit more closely at Class 6 under EPA, on the left is topics, this is not a complete list, but some topics that are inside the scope of Class 6, and then topics that are outside the scope of Class 6 and must be dealt with at the state level. So inside the scope, site selection and AOR, what's in your CO2 stream, the well design, casing and cementing, the modeling and monitoring of the plume, some of the core parts of Class 6 that differentiates it from other forms of underground injection control classes. You really need to understand where is your CO2 likely to go, and then monitor that as your project goes on to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, in an iterative process between monitoring and modeling and monitoring and modeling and keeping track of where your CO2 is. Post-injection site care starts to get at this question that we're discussing about long-term stewardship. A post-injection site care happens after you're done injecting, but before you get a closure certificate from EPA or your state. And that is basically monitoring and modeling, plugging, monitoring, and modeling. Financial assurance, Class 6 has very robust financial assurance and bonding requirements, which, as Bhaskar notes, get released at closure time and raises questions of what happens afterwards. And there's a little, but not very much, on emergency response in Class 6. Outside the scope is the question that Bhaskar was focusing on towards the end of his presentation, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, the post-closure site care and liability. Induced seismicity is another issue that, unless it's big enough to threaten the storage complex, induced seismicity is not addressed in Class 6. Nevertheless, it is an issue that community members care about a lot. The only thing that I've ever seen is getting close to taking away social license to operate for oil and gas development in energy-friendly communities is induced seismicity, as has been happening in Oklahoma and Texas in the last 10 or 15 years because of Class 2 disposal. Community outreach is also mostly outside the scope of Class 6. Local zoning questions like, can a municipality say we don't want this here? That's outside of Class 6. The gigantic topics of the capture and transport components, including on eminent domain question for pipelines, is also outside the scope of Class 6, which only deals with sequestration. Conflicts between mineral and sequestration projects, that could be a problem. If someone has a mineral estate underneath the storage complex, they're allowed to access the mineral estate. How can that occur without causing integrity problems for one or both projects? outside the scope of Class 6. The funding of, where does this money come from? The tax credit type stuff outside of Class 6. And public reporting of volume sequestered, that too is outside of Class 6, something that's currently dealt with in the US through the GHG RP, the reporting program, which is in the process of potentially going away. So there's a lot related to this topic that's outside the scope of Class 6, and thus states need to take action to fill the gaps. And so there's an entity in the United States called the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It is the Association of State Oil and Gas Regulators. It's been around since the 1930s. It is something that the US Constitution allows, interstate compacts. And IOGCC put out its first model statute on CCS in 2007 or 2008. And many of the state statutes that were adopted in 2009, 2010, which was during a time when there was a big climate bill being discussed in the US, and it seemed like CCS would be part of that program. But the climate bill didn't pass, and the whole industry went to sleep for a decade or so. And so the first version of this model statute was without the benefit of the last, let's say, 18 years of learning. And so IOGCC and its regulators decided to do an update. And that process started in, I want to say 2023, and it was published at the end of last year. And you could see some of the topics that are listed here as model statute sections give you a sense of what's on the regulator's mind. It corresponds relatively well to the not within the four corners of Class 6 list from the last slide. And you could see hot button issues like the sequestration facility trust fund, liability release, that's the post-closure stuff, induced seismicity management, pore space, and things along those lines. And this is available online. It's fairly easy to get through a web search. So here's a short case study on issues that the Environmental Defense Fund found when considering the Texas's application for Class 6 primacy, which was noticed in the Federal Register by EPA last year. So the states go through a process in order to get primacy where they have to show that in the case of Class 6 that they have equivalent or greater, basically identical to the Federal Register or greater protections, and that they're prepared to run the program and all that. And it's a 18-month plus back and forth process with EPA. There's crosswalks, there's memorandum of understanding. 18 months is fast for it to happen. It often takes 3 or 4 years, although it is speeding up as more states are getting primacy. And Texas mostly adopted Class 6 with some modifications, and so it met the basics for primacy. But there's all these other issues that are outside of the scope of Class 6 that we felt like Texas should at least be alerted to and think about. So one item on this list, in fact, the first one, is this question of long-term stewardship and liability management, and I'm going to do a deep dive on that on the next slide, so not get into it too much here. Texas has actually not gone the way of many other states and said, we will take on all your liability. It is limited. Nevertheless, we had some notes for Texas there that as I said, I'll get into in a minute. On regulatory capacity and permitting efficiency, the question is, do you have enough people at your agency and at your sister agencies that need to look into this to be able to do this work at scale, fast enough, with high quality? In Texas in particular, it's not just the Railroad Commission. TCEQ, the environmental agency, which has primacy over Class 1 hazardous injection wells, has to go through a process to make sure that the Class 6 well would not endanger any Class 1 wells, for example. And they're over capacity, and it's hard for them to get that work through. So that was an issue. Monitoring well integrity. Those of you following this space know about the problems at the Archer Daniels Midland facility in Illinois last year, where a monitoring well seem to allow the escape of something like 8 tons of CO2 outside the confining zone. The issue was that the monitoring well was completed, was in the plume and completed and opened in multiple zones. And so it allowed for corrosion, and you had a leak. And EPA sprung up and said, well, you need to use, Chrome 13 or this and that. When really the lesson was, if you don't put your monitoring wells in your plume, and if you do, make sure they're not completed in multiple zones. This is an ongoing issue in the CCS community to figure out how to deal with. Induced seismicity monitoring and management. Again, this is a huge issue for people. If you're putting anything underground and you're growing the pressure over time, you are liable to cause earthquakes, and you need a system in place to monitor for that and make changes as you go to keep earthquakes at a socially acceptable minimum. Texas has some of that already in place, and we provided some ideas of how to do it better. On conversions, so Bhaskar talked a little bit about Class 2. So Class 2 is for oil and gas waste disposal and enhanced oil recovery. And so there's some circumstances where, like the acid gas injection, where an operator is really doing a Class 6 disposal project, but they're doing it through a Class 2 well, which is a lot cheaper, and there's less that you need to do regulatorily, including on plume monitoring and that sort of thing. And so the Railroad Commission has a internal guidance on when they tell Class 2 injectors, hey, sorry, you actually have a Class 6 project and you need to upgrade it. And so they have it written in guidance, and we just want to make sure that that gets properly implemented, and that you don't have abuses of acid gas disposal. And then Class 5 to Class 6 is sometimes a well is permitted as an experimental well, which Class 5 covers among other things. And then if it gets converted to Class 6, you want to make sure that it has the right kind of construction and integrity associated with it. Leakage pathway assessments and undocumented orphan wells. So this is an issue where we have millions of wells that we've drilled in the United States, and some of them have been properly plugged and abandoned, and many of them not. And a lot of wells were drilled in a pre-regulatory era, especially in Appalachia and East Texas and Oklahoma and other places where you don't necessarily know if you have a fluid pathway. And while Class 6 requires an area of review, it doesn't require, let's say, magnetometer surveys to find potential additional wells. So we recommended that. And I'm seeing that I'm already coming up on 15 minutes. So let me speed through these and get to stewardship and liability management. Conflicts between subsurface uses. This is where you want to make sure that when you're drilling for your minerals, you don't screw up a CCS project, something regulators need to pay attention to. Pressure, space, and project interaction. If you have multiple projects going in, the way that the Class 6 works is you only look at one at a time. But if they're close to each other, they can interfere. You can have pressure impacts that go far beyond the AOR. 2 projects next to each other. You may have a well that doesn't appear in either AOR, but if you treated them as a system, they appear in both. So that's an issue. Offshore, I agree that offshore is generally better if you can make it work. But EPA's Class 6 says, well, if you don't have an underground source of drinking water, which is a technical term, then you have different requirements. And so we want to make sure that wells in state waters don't get lower standards because you still don't want it to leak. Better emergency and remedial response planning. As I said, Class 6 is pretty skimpy on this, and there's a lot more that can be done. Some states like Louisiana have passed laws on that. And then community engagement. There's huge skepticism of this technology for various reasons, including ones Bhaskar raised. And getting in front of the community and getting buy-in and comfort is critical, if difficult. And so finally and quickly, let's talk about post-closure stewardship and liability management from my perspective. So I certainly agree that in the long term, you cannot rely on an operator to deal with anything and everything that might happen over 1,000 years. They may not be there. The best we have are governments, and so at the state level, they may not be there for 1,000 years either, but what are you going to do? And so what happens at the end of the project life? You've done your post-injection site care period, and you apply for a closure certificate where you tell the regulator, whether it's EPA or the state, everything happened the way it's supposed to, the plume is stabilized, we've plugged all the wells, no future problems expected, no contamination of underground sources of drinking water expected. And then you get a closure certificate, which under EPA means you get your financial assurance back and your normal regulatory responsibilities go away. So some states in the early years said, let's have the state take on ownership or rights to the CO2 and all responsibility for it and all possible liability for it as well. And so we at EDF and others were concerned about this, because if you relieve an operator of their civil and criminal and contractual liability, then you've created incentive for the operator to not do as good of a job as they could have done, because they're not going to be liable. And all that needs to happen is the regulator needs to miss some detail in the closure certificate application and say, oh, well, this is good. If they miss it, then the state, can take on kind of unlimited long-term liability, which is not right. And there's a public, there's public pushback, because someone from the public can say, why are you states in the CCS industry telling us, hey, this is safe, we know what we're doing, it's going to be okay, and at the same time saying, but you have to eliminate our liability or else we're not going to do it. And so EDF worked with the Great Plains Institute on an approach that would allow for the transfer of at least the regulatory liability, and to set up a fund so that the state can take care of routine monitoring and maintenance. These funds, by the way, usually are like 7 to 10 cents a ton. And if it is discovered that the operator failed to disclose something, or lied about something, or did not behave in workmanlike fashion over the course of the project, or there's a disruption to the USDW, then the regulator can go back to the operator for satisfaction. And that basic framework is something that the Global CCS Institute has picked up on, and is basically what is in the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission model statute. And so there's an array of post-closure stewardship and liability management legislative approaches, from saying nothing about it at all to creating a system where responsibility and ownership is transferred, and the state gets a per ton fee over the course of the project. And then some states take on all liability. Some states explicitly exclude civil, criminal, and contractual. And so it's very much an open issue. It's live. A lot of states are dealing with this right now. And I'm going to stop presenting and look forward to having a discussion about it.
Thank you, Adam. So thanks for speeding through your presentation. It was very good, and I must say, but it's such a hard job, I think, being regulating some sectors. So, there's a bit of background noise, maybe from I don't know, Basker or Jovan. Okay, well, anyway, so I'll remove the presentation. That's good. We've had a few questions from the audience. The first one is from Rick Shalaturnik, and it's probably for you, Basker. Rick was asking if I satisfy the new version of ISO 27914, would that be sufficient for most regulators? But I'm not very familiar with that.
Yes. In most cases outside the US, Ellen says yes. 27914 actually does fit what the minimum requirements is. Unfortunately, in the US, we follow ISO. So it's kind of up in the air. It's more an API regulation than anything else. Yes, that is what generically most of the world follows.
Very good. Okay. There's one from Dharmesh Mehta that's a bit long, so I hope it'll show on screen correctly. System integrity is it really depends on engineering. I'll let you read the question. Regulatory compliance. Is that a question actually? I think it's a comment, but I like the way you framed it, Bhaskar, and just touched on some of the issues. I certainly, as a member of the WITS, I have to say that most of the issues that you have mentioned are no easy ones, and they will require quite a bit of ingenuity for resolution. So a lot of challenges. If you listed the challenges without necessarily providing a lot of reassurance that it can be done. It's not easily, not necessarily it will be easily done. And there's a final question from Hiwa Abdullah from Germany.
Oh, this is a loaded question. I'll pick this one up, and Adam, you can jump in as well. So I'm going to put 1 foot on each side. Okay, so I'm going to go 1 foot on the CCS side, 1 foot on the regular side, right? The liability perspective. There are kind of 2 ways to do this, right? If you put all the liability on the operator and say, okay, for the next 1,000 years you're responsible, no operator in his right mind would actually do the project. There's not enough incentive to take that kind of liability. All right. So the state has to take some of the liability. There's no choice in the matter. Right. It's a question of how much liability they're going to take. For example, Adam brought up and said, yeah, we could keep the operator liable for a certain amount of time. Again, we're talking about 100 years or maybe 200 years until the company doesn't exist anymore, and in which case they takes over the liability again. So there's no clear answer in my mind how this actually works. But I do know that having internal conversations at all companies, that moment you say you're going to be liable, for the next 100 years or 150 years, the answer is going to be no. All right, we're not doing this because, as it is, the economics are tight on CCS. To take on that type of liability on top of this, a tough call. Adam, I'm sure you've got a different perspective.
Well, there are statutes of limitation, at least in the U.S., and so you're not, without additional legislation, you're not necessarily liable forever, no matter what. On the other hand, the EPA reserves the right that if there's endangerment to an underground source of drinking water, they can go back to the operator. And that's regardless of what a state does in its legislation. The EPA, as a federal agency, can always go back to an operator that has threatened USDW. And states will often go back to operators if there's let's say a geyser coming out of an improperly plugged well that was plugged 70 years ago. The state may go after the successor companies and say, well, you took on this well, and there was a compliance problem even then, and so you are the one who has to deal with it. I have spoken to lots of CCS developers that think that even if a state takes on liability, if something goes really wrong, that company, if it still exists, is going to get sued anyway. And so that's why there's some CCS operators have said, we don't want any liability relief because you're going to make us do it anyway, and it makes us all look bad. And then, as Bhaskar was saying, there are, insurance products available increasingly for this. And the reason for that is a good news story, which is that a properly sited, operated, closed, and monitored carbon sequestration facility has a very low risk of a problem. And so a lot of insurance companies have said, hey, this is a great deal to insure because nothing's, probably going to happen. Now, those could be famous last words, but the geology around this is fairly well understood. And as long as you don't screw it up, it should work out.
Very good. I'll use my privilege and ask one question to both of you regarding monitoring and detection of potential issues. So you've both been, I assume, working on it from different perspectives. So the engineering part, the emergency response part, but also for you, Adam, very active on the detection front and solutions for methane, etc. So in a few words, what do you think would be a good monitoring program and surveillance program, both locally on the ground and maybe, I don't know, from space or something like that, similar to methane for CCS projects?
So I can start and then hand it to Bhaskar. So what I've learned about how you set up a monitoring program comes from Sue Havorka at the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology. So if you have questions on how to design your monitoring program, go talk to Sue. And basically her philosophy is that you need to figure out what you think your risks are and what it is that you're worried might occur, and then design your monitoring program around that. And so that will tell you, where do you put your monitoring wells? What kind of monitoring wells do you have? Do you have surface deformation monitoring? Do you have induced seismicity monitoring? Where should those go? And then do you change that over time as your plume grows? And so it, like everything else with CCS, it's iterative, but start by identifying your risks and then design your monitoring program around that.
Okay, so from my perspective, I did, before I went into energy transition, actually quite a bit of work on underground storage of gas wells. So there is a very significant body of experience on monitoring them and how to monitor underground storage systems, how to monitor where they're leaking or what they're leaking, and how to monitor the wells that exist in those underground storage systems. They're quite old. Normally, in underground storage systems are almost 100 years old. So you find some old wells that you're leaking and plug it in. So those monitoring systems and systems actually exist. What difficulty really comes what you do when an event occurs. So I'll go back to the emergency response plan. If you look at class 6, emergency response plan is a one paragraph conversation. But an emergency response plan on CO2, I don't think we've ever had breach of CO2. I don't think we even know how to manage one, even if we tried. And that's a discussion that will occur at some point, and somebody will come up with an answer. All right. That worries me more than the monitoring, because the next question after monitoring is, what if it breaches? And that's where the hard questions are going to come up, which we haven't resolved yet.
Do you think we should have an example worked on paper, Bhaskar?
Well, a nice risk assessment would be good, with well-controlled people around the table and what you're going to do. My guess is going to be there's going to be really well, because nobody's going to try to kill a breach CO2 well. I think they'll take an act of God to try to pull that off. But again, exercise should be done. At least we have an idea of what we would do on a situation like that.
Thank you.
One thing
Yep,
that was
Adam.
learned in the Satarsha leak in Mississippi, which was from a CO2 pipeline and not from a well. And, probably if there's going to be an emergency in this system, it'll be from the pipeline and not from the well itself. And so there were learnings about, in addition to the integrity learnings about the pipeline, from emergency response plan, are the local responders trained in this incident? Do they know who to call? Do they have non-combustion engine vehicles? Because if your ambulance or fire truck is in a CO2 plume, the combustion engine won't work, and things along those lines. And so, as I said, Louisiana has funded or has required additional emergency response planning, requiring coordination with local responders, providing funding for local responders and that sort of thing. And that's really important for public trust as well.
Very good. Jovan, I think you had one question.
Yeah, well, I will take opportunity to ask a very short answer. One, going to Bhaskar, and I will ask, taking all this, let's say, in consideration what we discussed today, did you foresee that we will have upgraded version of design required for the CCUS before we face any of failure? And one for Adam, the same thing from regulatory body. Did regulatory body will go in front and say, but we need to improve design to avoid, which will be different than oil and gas and traditional tools what we have, but to impose some, let's say, innovative technology or innovative approach to reassure that we are securing the CO2. Yeah.
Okay. One of the reasons that we wrote this engineering manual for CCS well design was for the very reason you just mentioned. All right. It's been written, it's out there, and we will clear this engineering design manual. Problem really is that we don't necessarily have an API status or a ISO status that says this is how you design CCS well. Everybody's got their own idea of how to design one. And, at least from the SPE's perspective or the oil and gas perspective, we should have this on paper so that it doesn't come back bite us later on. In simple terms, I don't know how you progress things like that, but we should have something in that order.
Thanks, Bhaskar.
So
Adam?
what I would add is that, as Bhaskar was pointing out, there have not been a lot of these projects, at least in the US so far. And I think that one regulatory perspective is, okay, well, we've had Class 6 on the books for a while. Let's build some of these wells and operate these projects and see what happens and make adjustments as we need to. And then the regulators have these fora like the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commissions to discuss problems that come up and how to deal with them. So a lot of this stuff is just going to come out in practice. That said, there are various stakeholders that are ready for a Class 6 upgrade. So we'll see what kind of timetable that happens on.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, it's a difficult one, Jovan, and the issue becomes, are you prescriptive or do you want to just operate by philosophy? And the prescription is challenging, because if you miss something, then that's it. It's on you. So it's no easy task. Absolutely. There was a question from Mahdi Sheikh Zari, which I'm going to show, but Mahdi, we cannot go into the specific challenges of cement integrity and CCS projects because we would need another webinar to do that. So I'm going to just showed it, and thank you for your question. Jovan, maybe a few words on upcoming events, upcoming webinars before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I also want to use this opportunity to call all our well integrity community and the people who is following us to check our LinkedIn page and our SP web page for the upcoming webinars, which one will be in the end of March, related to the well integrity in the gas storage wells, made by SP WIS and SP Friends section. And another one is related to the AI. Pierre, you can announce this one.
It hasn't been announced yet, but it'll be the one good trial to harness machine learning and AI to help people risk assess integrity issues. So within a specific regulatory framework in the North Sea, but great. It's a catch up of a webinar we had 2 years ago with Repsol, Sinopec, and Salis on risk assessments. Yep.
Yeah, and please reach us on the LinkedIn page and give us your comments, feedbacks, and whatever you like to hear from us and from the community, and then we can reach people who can talk a little bit more in details, and then to use community as a spread of knowledge and experience. We are always as a top priority for us.
Very good. So thank you both, Bhaskar and Adam, for your good presentation and the thought-provoking discussion. I enjoyed it today. We left a lot of questions unanswered. It was also one of the intentions. We can't cover everything in an hour and a half, but thank you for questions from the audience. Anybody watching this can get back to Bhaskar or Adam separately if you want to engage in additional discussions. And I'll thank you everyone again, and we'll see you at another webinar. You may now disconnect. Thank you.
You know, people ask me why they should join SPE, and what I tell them is that SPE is absolutely essential. Frankly, if SPE didn't exist, somebody would have to go out and create it. When you graduate with a technical degree, a petroleum engineering degree, or other engineering degree, you get a lot of really good knowledge that gets you started on your career, and you learn a lot on the job. But the jobs that we have in this industry, they're really quite difficult. And you've got to have other resources, either to solve specific problems you might be having at the moment, or to better understand how to solve, daily issues that you work on. SPE provides opportunities to learn about new things that people are working on. There are great articles in JPT magazine and the other magazines that we have that are really useful. If you're not reading JPT every month, I tell you, it's essential to do that to keep up with the technology. We have excellent conferences where you can learn from people who have solved very difficult problems in our industry. And doing that is just incredibly important and incredibly useful. To me, I don't see how you can be an engineer working in the petroleum industry and not find value in the resources and the opportunities that SPE provides. It's an opportunity to meet people who can help you in the industry, and it's an opportunity to get the knowledge you need to be successful.